Clark described was essentially wall-to-wall fuel across this valley. Now, since settlement, the valley was quickly irrigated. Then we had, of course, domestic grazing. In recent times, we've had heavy development. So the fuels now are very broken up, the fuel landscape. But Lewis and Clark describe a fuel landscape that was essentially contiguous. They, in their trek just through what is now Montana, they encountered, George Gould wrote this up in a paper, but it was something like 10 fires burning on the landscape, of which they attributed 8 of them, it's right in that area, 7 or 8 were they attributed to Native American burning.
We're just going to do a quick overview in terms of what were the events that were occurring in Fires of 2000, and as sounds like some of you were here, you can probably relive those 14 years ago, kind of what some of the impacts that were happening not only to the Bitterroot Valley residents but also to the firefighters that came and went throughout the course of the summer. It was a pretty interesting scene, but the impact of the fire siege of 2000 was pretty impressive. Of all the fires combined, we had a total of just over 356,000 acres, and we're going to kind of walk through that chronology of events that kind of led up to why it was so bad and how many fires. And like I said, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the fire managers when they get this information, because here you are trying to explain to the public, okay, now what are we going to do, because you just got slapped with a bunch of fires and you don't know where you're starting from and where you're going to end. So if you remember back in 1998, there was a weather phenomenon that was starting to form. It was called La Nina, and it was starting to create some changes in the climate and temperatures and stuff that were going to drastically impact what we call fire season 2000. So through that La Nina building, what we ended up having is by the fall of 1999, we ended up with conditions that were reminiscent of, we had no moisture, our snowpacks were significantly diminished, and again, what was setting itself up 2 years prior to this event was creating conditions to where we didn't recognize it until it actually happened. So basically lost all their snowpack by February. Our actual snowpack levels that year were only 55 to 70% of normal. And for us, that's unusual, because if you look at the conditions today, we're significantly a lot higher out there, and I know that we'll talk a little bit more in the field. So as we were coming into February, by the end of February, we had already lost all of our snowpack in the valleys. And so live fuel moistures, obviously, they kind of went through a pre-spring green up condition. And so by the time that July arrived, when we started getting the first fires, we were basically a fully cured dead situation, and usually we won't start seeing that until the latter part of July into August, so we were like 3 months way ahead. So our conditions were pretty dire at the time. So the Bitterroot National Forest up until this time actually ended up having about, we already had about 115 fires on the forest before the end of July. And for us, we average anywhere from 135 to 165 fires a year, which is actually quite a bit. Most of that is from lightning. And then this is no different. So how does it all begin? You are in fire season. Guess what? We have a lot of lightning. A lot of lightning tracks basically from southwest to northeast through these valleys. And so you'll see storms develop over the Selway and the Salmon Chalice and Payette, and it'll track right over and then move to the northeast. So that's kind of how the series of storms is going to come in and start. So you are now looking at July 31st on this map, and I don't know why it says 92. But they basically ended up mapping, like I said, the forest had about 115 starts already. Guess what? Your lightning storm just laid down 78 new strikes. So as of the end of 2000 into 2001, total cost of the fires of 2000 was $85,640,400. $4.25. This was before the burned area emergency rehabilitation stuff had kicked in, which I think was pushing it towards another $50 million is what I kept hearing about. So again, this is kind of now your issue. Again, how would you address the public? What concern would you be looking at? You had a whole entire valley impacted by the series of events that materialized out of 2000. And then you have to deal with the aftermath of what comes next is recovering. How do you get there? And to prepare for the next round of fires that probably will come. And
Hit some people. You guys are probably, I read in the Missoulian something about, somebody was saying that this is a people issue. Yeah, it's a people issue. If nobody lived around here, nobody cared. You let it burn, it comes back, you do your thing. People are the answer to this. And that's what Australia found out with their Prepare, Stay, Go Early, Stay and Defend program. You gotta get all your resources working for you. In our case, we adopted that program, but then we had Fire Safe Montana. Okay, and there was a group of, 10 or 12 of us who kind of got that thing going. And that's all about how do you build appropriately for living in the WUI? How do you clear your property? How do you use the right construction materials so that fire doesn't want to burn? It doesn't want to take out houses left and right.
Ready, set, go.
There is one critical thing. Bruce Sunram, he's a guy who's done a lot of fire stuff in the state. He and I did presentations a couple years ago. And basically, he described the Australian program when he was talking about Ready, Set, Go, except for one thing. Ready, Set, Go waits too long to say it's time to evacuate. And it's a critical error that's going to get people hurt. Load up.
Have you all heard of this resolution that Wilson Park County and Broadwater County and Jefferson County have come up with? Anybody has heard of that resolution?
Yeah. Oh, cool.
It started with that Yarnell fire. My wife and I were listening to the radio and some of the reports from that, and she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, you know, we lost 19 good men for sticks and bricks. And I thought, you know, that's enough. Enough is enough. And I wrote a paper, titled that, and it was picked up pretty much by the Fire Safe Montana. I developed I put together a three-pronged approach to that and presented it to the Lewis and Clark Borough Fire Council, of which one of our county commissioners is a member. And he took that and took it to the county commission and unanimously put together this resolution and unanimously approved it. Since then, we have the similar resolution approved unanimously by Broadwater County and Jefferson County. Looks like the city of Helena is going to do the same thing right soon.
Just one variation on the resolution that I've heard somebody make. I think Bob Much was one of them. But it is when addressing residents of the wildland urban interface, and they're wondering, well, gee, do I really need to do anything to my place? You know, somebody says, well, lay a little guilt trip on them. You know, your place, if somebody comes in here to protect it, they're risking their lives. How would you feel about having one or two or more firefighters die trying to protect your place? And we can't guarantee that won't happen if you don't clean it up, because, you know, yeah, the regulation is, yeah, they're not supposed to be coming in here because you have such a narrow road and you haven't done anything. But they might come in here anyhow to try to protect your place, and they might die. How are you going to feel about that? You know, I mean, I think we need to lay it on some of these reluctant people a little harder.
And I can tell you that's worked in my community. Because our people are saying, no, we haven't cleaned it up, don't go in there. In fact, we're going to put a tree across the road so nobody can get in there until we do get it cleaned up. So they are very conscious of the firefighters.
Okay.
Yeah, they went and looked at the carcasses and they looked at the, I don't know, all the tune marks.
Yeah, and how they, whether they
Yeah, whether
eat
they-
it in place or it's scattered. But yeah, so they also look for
It's about 14,000 square miles. It's a big granitic intrusion that, for various reasons, they call it deeply weathered. The bedrock is not very strong. It's cracked, it's fractured, it breaks down easily. Second key is how it weathers. It weathers into fairly low density, large particle soils that are not highly fertile. Okay, it's also got fairly poor water retention, so that means a lot to the vegetation as we go through the fire cycle. The water that is here in the winter, you see the feet of snow up there. We had several feet of snow here earlier. And in a lot of places, the top foot of soil is now fairly dry. Our location, we're west of the Continental Divide, that means a lot to our weather patterns. So that makes us a little hotter and drier in the summer and fairly wet in the winters. So during the summer we have a push sometimes from the Columbia Plateau. If anybody's been out there, not many trees and dang hot. And so we get this course of hot, dry air to dry this place out, and then we get thunderstorms when the moist air from the more coastal northwest comes in and mixes with that, gets lifted. So you get these on again, off again moisture spells, which are enough to drive the thunderstorms, but they're not enough to bring us enough water to put out any of the lightning stars. So we got the landform. We've got a erodible landform, and it's uplifted, meaning it's bound to be cutting down all the water bodies in it. Any place that has active uplift going on in the Rocky Mountains has steep rocky canyons. It's a young landscape. And two, we've got the climate that is pretty appropriate for growing fuel and then getting it started. The old timber process was to take basically everything that was economical. So when they first logged this area, it was cut pretty thin. I doubt that there was much left over 6-8 inches. So that takes all the big fire resistant trees out. We get a lot of brushy regrowth. The smaller trees come in fast, and you have kind of a little bit of homogenization of the forest. It's not as patchy as it used to be. It's denser, and if, like the railroad sections that Larry managed, if you don't have some incentive to do fuels treatments after the logging, you don't. You just leave the fuel on the ground. And the fine fuels are generally what drive intense fires. All that slash was left up there, the big parts of the trees hauled out for boards. And so that's another way that this drainage was kind of set up for severe impacts. So the fire starts, comes in, we've got a brushy continuous fuel load. We don't have that many trees that will survive the fire, as you can see. We got no shade. And we get a high intensity fire. So after the fire, what goes away is the one single component that is holding the place together, and that's the vegetation. Because of these deeply weathered soils and granitic origin, we've got a situation where once you remove this, and if it's a higher than normal severity fire, you're going to get more of that than you would in a historical regime where you had spotty fires all the time. You're setting yourself up for a large percentage of any given watershed being denuded, being taken down to granitic soil. While that happens, you're removing the sponge that lays on top of the ground. You're removing the organic soil cover. And we saw this, we've seen this in almost any vegetation type, in that the soils, once you pull that ground cover off, it loses its protection from rain splash. It loses a frictional component that inhibits high speed surface flow, high velocity flow. And ends up leading to concentration of flows. And what you get right across from us is one of the gullies that formed here in Rye Creek. And you can see that there still has some raw bank to it. But when it first happened, probably, Karen can probably talk about this a little bit, probably what, 1.5 meters, 2 meters deep.
Probably. I didn't get to see it until 2008 or
Couple
something.
years
so
after.
It was 8 years later, and it can start to fill in pretty quickly, but yeah,
Right.
1 meter, 2 meters, maybe 3 in places.
So they get quite deep and they several meters wide, but there's, both during the events and afterwards, there's a colluvial process that augments the fluvial process, the water erosion and the gravity powered erosion. The banks keep falling in. So you can transport a lot of material in short order. In fact, most of the, we call them debris flows, most of the debris flows that happen in these post-fire situations occur 15 minutes, 30 minutes long, and they're done. But they've moved literally thousands and thousands of cubic yards of material in 15 minutes in any given drainage. We build up these fans at the bottom, which is that V-shaped situation over there where it's kind of filled in, it's a little bit less steep, and the gully will cut a channel one side or the other in that. In fact, Karen pointed out there's 2 channels in that one. So alluvial fans are a natural phenomena. The stream will cut against the bottom of it over time and remove that material, send it downriver.
So I want to go back to the debris flows
Go
for
ahead.
just a second, just because I studied these for my dissertation.
Yes,
so
let's hear about
I think
it.
they're kind of cool, and Ed did a really good job, so I don't really have much to add. But one of the things that I think is kind of cool to realize about them is in these kind of areas, they are responsible for most of the erosion. So there's some studies indicating that the amount of sediment that's going out daily in the stream is about order of magnitude 10 times less than what gets delivered in these episodic events. So they're kind of, these debris flows are the major driver of topography here in a lot of ways. And after you've walked around on enough of these debris flow pans, you start to notice how they form the stream course in a lot of instances, especially where we've seen a lot of them recently. The stream is making its way around the toe of all of these debris flow fans. And another thing I realized after walking around on them for a while, and I don't want to get into Mike's topic at all, but people regard these kind of like fire, as in this is a disaster, this is not a good event, this is a bad thing for the watershed. And maybe that is true in the short term, but you also realize that it is bringing down the larger rocks that we know are good for fish now, and then when you have a fire on top of that, it's delivering large woody debris to the stream. Which
Director of Friends of the Bitterroot, a grassroots conservation group that is really not about recreation. What we're about is ecosystem health. It's the foundation for our lives and all the lives of the residents in the woods. Here in the Bitterroot, like, we were formed in 1986. We've only ever stopped one timber sale, and that was this proposed salvage. I pointed out that fire that started at a home, and they were wanting to do that under a categorical exclusion. We told them, no, it's not legal. Judge Malloy, over a weekend, 3 days, he made a ruling. You can't do that. Clearly, you can't do that. Otherwise, we've never stopped a timber sale. We have neither appealed nor litigated a timber sale on this forest for 8 years. Nobody has appealed or litigated a timber sale on this forest for 8 years. The last time we did was the Middle East Fork timber sale, and it went on ahead in spite of our efforts. We're called obstructionists. I like to think of it as a guardrail. You know, are guardrails obstructing? Well, yeah, but for good reason. But basically, we believe in science, law, and democratic process in managing public forests. So I believe that even the best science will never fully understand the forest. And so active management necessarily involves unforeseen like consequences. And so, but we believe that, you know, nature has a way, just the ability to regenerate. People who go to school and get trained in management just have, it's like any paradigm, like, it's like a fish doesn't notice the water. A paradigm's a way of thinking that usually you don't even know you're thinking that way. We conservationists have, you know, a different paradigm. Anyway, management paradigm, I think, it's like it needs to be managed, you know? It's like if it's your job, you need to feel needed. And so I think some of what I would consider over-management has to do with this management paradigm that gets drilled in. And you can see it sometimes where, you know, it's in various ways, especially, you know, around fire, because fire is so emotional and really gets the public's attention. And so the managers have a spotlight on them and they got to do something, you know, so.
This is a trout fishery, okay? It's a cold water fishery and it's recreational. There's no commercial fishery here, and we're generally talking small trout less than 10 inches long. We have 2 native species on the Bitterroot Forest, the West Slope cutthroat trout, which is our state fish, and the bull trout, which is a ESA, Endangered Species Act, threatened species. Generally, West Slope cutthroat trout are pretty common on the forest, like in North Rye Creek. 99% of the fish in North Rye Creek right behind you are West Slope cutthroat trout. Bull trout are not present in this drainage. They may have, you know, decades ago been here. We have no record of them being in North Rye, but they're less common on the forest. So, just right after the fires, we had an opportunity here. We got approached by a grad student at Montana State University who wanted to do a post-fire fish recovery project. And the reason they came here was A, we had a lot of burn streams, and B, we also had a very good pre-fire database of mark recapture population estimates in many streams across the forest. So it would make for a good comparison study. At that time, this was unprecedented. Since then, there have been lots of big fires all over the place, and to tell you the truth, we don't get very excited about them anymore. But this was a big deal because we thought that the native fishery might collapse and that some of the non-native trout species that we have here, we have brook, brown, and rainbow trout, might take over these streams. That was the thought, okay? So the grad student's name was Clint Sestrich, and he did a bunch of mark recapture electrofishing estimates in 2001, 2, and 3 in burn streams of varying severity and in control streams that were not burned. What did he find? Okay, there were 3 main questions that he was asking. He said, did our damaged native populations, the West Slope cutthroat trout and the bull trout, recover? And what he found was yes. Most of our population, this really surprised us, most of our populations approached or exceeded pre-fire abundance levels by the 3rd year of a study after fire. We weren't expecting that. The second question was kind of what we were expecting. Did brook trout increase in the burned streams and did they displace the natives? And the answer was, in most of the streams, it was surprisingly no. It was actually suppressed. In fact, the brook trout got knocked way back, and in a lot of these burned streams, like North Rye Creek, they still have a presence, but it's nowhere near what it was prior to 2000. There was one notable exception in the upper end of Rye Creek where brook trout exploded. And that's a hard one to explain because it's a high severity reach that looks a lot like this. And then the last question was, did we see invasions of non-natives? Did they come into streams where they weren't there before the fires? And the answer was yes. We found non-natives for the first time in 7 of the 30 streams. What was surprising was the non-native that we found most of the time was a brown trout. That was 5 of those 7. And we only found brook trout and rainbows show up in 1 site. And the number of, the positive thing was the number of the invaders was low. It was usually 1 or 2 fish. You know, we never saw them in any sizable numbers, too. Laird Creek was burned at high severity, tons of debris flows, killed almost all the fish in the stream. That's what's interesting about this. not in any single stream did every single fish die, no matter how hard it got burned. There were some 1,000-foot sections where we only found 1 or 2 survivors, but there were always some survivors. And wherever there were little unburned green islands, usually the numbers were pretty good when you went into those areas. So there's internal refuges within the stream corridor during a fire. These fish can be extirpated, but the West Slope cutthroat trout is a fire-adapted species that's pretty darn tough, because there's not a lot of habitat to go run and hide here. They had to come back on this spurn site.